So I heard your request. Today, we're going to learn how to use Spotify's API with JavaScript, specifically with React. Let's get started. What's going on, guys? I am back. Another day, another video. So I read your previous comments on my last JavaScript video, how to use Spotify's API with JavaScript. It was requested that I make a similar video, but using React. So this video will be how to use Spotify's API with React. Very unique, right? We'll be calling Spotify's API with React, which is still JavaScript, but it's React, so yeah. Now, unlike my last video, I won't go through the process of creating a mockup because the end results will be exactly the same. The only difference is that everything will be done using React versus with vanilla JavaScript. Now, both projects are available on GitHub, and I'll supply the link below in the description. As you're watching the video, please leave a comment. Let me know if the tutorial is working for you and/or maybe you have a different approach. I'd like to hear that too. Also, it would be great if you please share this video and share the channel. But that's enough talking, so let's get to work. I've already gone through the process of running my npm/npx commands. I ran the standard npx create react app command. That said, I removed some of the boilerplate files that get generated so that you can get the essence of how to create the app from scratch. You can use whatever HTTP client you want, but I'm going to use Axios, so I installed that package. Just like the last video, I'm using Bootstrap for styling, so you'll want to install that package as well. Additionally, you'll also need to install jQuery and Popper.js to utilize Bootstrap's JavaScript components in your app. Also, notice that I'm importing the Bootstrap CSS as my first dependency in my index.js file. First thing we'll do is import React in our app.js file, because we're going to be rendering this component to the DOM. Again, we're doing this project in React hooks, so we'll only be using functional components. If you like class components, well, sorry. We'll create a functional component called app where we'll return some basic JSX. The look for JSX is very similar to HTML. JSX essentially tells React what the UI should look like. We're going to render some test data just to ensure everything is running correctly. We're going to import the app component into our index.js file, as this file will mount our app. We run npm start, and our message displays correctly. Here's our mockup, even though I said I wasn't going to do a mockup, but I'm not creating it in front of you, so it's already made. But yeah, our mockup is going to have two drop downs, a submit button, a clickable list box, and a detail section for the track. Now, even though this is a small app and we won't have a bunch of sections with it, it's still good to make child components in places where we can reuse functionality. That said, since the drop down functionality will be similar, we'll create a component to handle that. We'll create a component to handle our list box functionality, as well as a component to handle our detail functionality. A functional component is just a JavaScript function that accepts props as an argument and returns a React element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and code, and then I'll explain afterwards what I did. Just like any JavaScript function, we can create various objects or variables inside. So we'll create an array of objects that will pass to our JSX. We'll use the standard JavaScript array map method to iterate through the array and create a select option per name value pair. Notice how this method call is placed inside the curly braces. In React, curly braces are used to evaluate JavaScript expressions. They can contain anything from method calls to calculations. If you notice, we use the index supply from the array map method as a key for each option. Obviously, there's no key property on a standard HTML option element. Keys are needed whenever you want to render lists to the DOM. They basically help identify elements in the list. We then import our dropdown into our app.js file. Let's make sure this works, and it does. Cool. Right now, we're populating our dropdown from inside of our dropdown component. That will change when we access the Spotify API. We'll actually receive the data as a prop from the app component. We'll go ahead and update the app component to pass data to the dropdown component. You'll notice that we created an array of objects in the app component. We added a property called options to the dropdown component. Inside the dropdown component, React automatically passes us an object called props that contain the properties we declared on the dropdown component from within the app.js file. We can then access those properties in our JSX. Eventually, we'll want to trigger an event, more specifically an API call whenever the change event fires on the dropdown. We'll need to have a reference to the dropdown selected value. We can maintain and access that selected value using state in React. React State allows you to basically manage information from within a component. And seeing how this is a React hooks video, we'll be utilizing the UseState hook. Try saying that 5 times fast. To utilize the UseState hook, we first need to import it in. The UseState hook is a name export, so we'll need to place the exact name inside of curly braces. UseState is a function that returns exactly 2 elements. The first element is a snapshot of the current state, meaning it's either the initial state or the updated state after the component re-renders. The second element is a function that allows you to update the current state. Using JavaScript array destructuring, we can access the current state and the function returned from the UseState hook. Also, be sure to initialize the state. We'll call our update state method whenever the change event fires on the dropdown, and we'll store our dropdown selected value. Just to show that we are successfully storing our selected value, we'll render it inside of a p tag. That looks pretty good. Our component is now using state to manage its own data. We'll go ahead and add our button, but we'll write further code for that later. We'll place an empty function into the onSubmit so we don't get compile errors. So I'd imagine if you're watching this video, it's a good chance that you saw my first JavaScript video, how to use Spotify's API with JavaScript. In that particular video, I explained how we're going to connect to Spotify. We'll use the client app credentials authorization flow. Now, what do you know? We're going to use the same flow for this video. So I'll go ahead and give you a minute. Go ahead and jump to that video to get those details. That was a joke. I wouldn't make you watch a whole nother video just so I can get more views. I wouldn't do that. Yeah, just kidding, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, so let's go over the information now. We're gonna go ahead and review our API calls. So with this particular flow, we're gonna be using a Spotify supplied token to send to the various API endpoints. When you first register your app with Spotify, they'll give you a client ID and a client secret. Our first API call will be to actually receive the token, which requires that we send that client ID and that client secret in an HTTP post request. So during our page load, we'll call the API to retrieve a token. Once that token is received, we'll immediately make another API call to receive a list of categories. We'll use those categories to populate our genre dropdown list. After we select the genre, we'll call the API again to get a list of playlists for that genre. Finally, after we get our playlist, or after we select the playlist, we'll click a submit button and we'll go out and retrieve a list of tracks for that playlist. And that'll be the last of the API calls. Now, all the data we receive from Spotify will be stored and or manipulated. So we'll be using the UseState hook to handle that. As I stated previously, I'm going to use Axios to handle our HTTP requests. After the token is returned, we'll store it in state. Technically, we could call the API directly in the function body, but that would actually be problematic. Let's see what happens when we do that. Notice how our app component kept rendering. This actually makes sense because when we call the UseState function, it will trigger a re-render of the component, which then causes re-execution of all the code inside the component, which means we keep calling the token API, basically an infinite loop. That is obviously bad. We can fix this situation by utilizing the UseEffect hook. By default, UseEffect will fire after the HTML form render has finished loading, and it will fire after every re-render. The advantage of UseEffect is that we can also dictate when it fires by providing what React refers to as a dependency. In React, a dependency will tell the UseEffect function to fire if the dependency is changed. The UseEffect function receives a function and a set of dependencies by way of an array that will dictate when it should fire. If we provide an empty array, we'll tell React to only fire the UseEffect hook one time. As you can see, our component is rendering correctly. Our first render occurs during page load, followed by another render that's triggered when we initialize the UseState hook. UseEffect executes and we call the UseState update function once we receive the token. In turn, it causes everything to re-render, which is why we see 4 log statements. You'll also notice that we receive a warning stating that UseEffect is missing dependencies client ID and client secret. Those are considered dependencies because while they are declared outside the UseEffect function, we are using it inside of it. Now the setToken function was declared outside. However, because it's a UseState function, React treats it differently to where it never really changes and in turn doesn't have to be considered a dependency. Eventually, we'll go ahead and add our client ID and client secret as dependencies, although they'll never really change. After we get the token, we'll pull a list of genres that will be passed to our dropdown. Again, we'll store all of our API data in state. You can initialize the state value to basically anything. The genres will be an array, so that's what we'll initialize our state to. We make a get call to the categories API endpoint and supply the acquired token in the HTTP header. Notice that the header type is authorization and we are supplying a bearer token. We update our options property to receive genres stored in state. Notice how we didn't have to change anything in our dropdown. All the previous functionality still works, which is made possible because the dropdown component only houses functionality within its own scope. It simply receives data and makes use of it. Currently, we are having the dropdown manage its own state. So when we make a selection, the selected value renders itself inside the p tag. What we want to do is retrieve playlists for a given genre. We could add a UseEffect hook directly inside of our component, have it fire when the genre is selected, and store the API playlist inside the dropdown state. But if we were to go that route, the app component would essentially need to ask the dropdown component for the dropdown state so that it could access the return playlist and pass into the playlist dropdown on the app component. I know that was a lot, so I hope that made sense. Now, while this is possible, it's not ideal because code can become difficult to understand and the probability of bugs increases. What's better is to have the app component store the entire app state, handle the API calls, and limit the dropdown functionality to simple rendering data and/or receiving props. This concept is called lifting state up. We'll now need to have state manage the selected genre in addition to the array of genres. The selected state will now be set by passing an app component method down to the dropdown component as a prop. We'll also pass the selected value as a prop. We create a change event handler inside the dropdown component that receives an event and calls the method received from the app component. We will also remove all the state related calls. In turn, this is now referred to as a stateless component. Now that the selected genre is stored, we'll make another API call to pull a list of playlists for the selected genre. We'll populate our playlist dropdown and we'll use code very similar to what we did for populating the genre dropdown. Let's take a look. Crap, it doesn't work. So let's see what's going wrong. We'll take a look at the dev tools. We'll go to the network tab and we'll click on our request to view the response. Specified ID does not exist. It's complaining about the genre ID that we are passing to the playlist API call. Here's the issue. We were previously using a value as the option value of our dropdown, but there's no key in the API result set called value. It should be called ID. Cool, looks good. Real quick, forgot to set the change event on the playlist dropdown. Make sure you don't forget that. Now we'll want to get a list of tracks for the selected playlist, but this time we'll use a button click event to trigger the API call. When we click the button, we'll call the API to pull a list of tracks and populate a list box component that the user can click on. We'll create a new component to hold the tracks. Now, I hope that you guys are getting just a little bit more comfortable with functional components, right? Because if not, that means I suck. So hopefully I don't suck. We'll pass our tracks data as props to our list box. Let's check it out. So that looks pretty good. Well, actually, visually it looks like crap because we actually haven't added styles yet, but I'll do that later on. But the key is that functionality is working correctly, so that's most important. Lastly, we'll want the user to be able to click on the list box item and view track details for that item. What's cool is that we really don't need to call the Spotify API in order to view track details. That information was also included when we pulled the list of tracks in our previous API call. We still need to manipulate and save track data, so we create a state variable for that as well. When we click on the list box item, we get the selected track ID because we set that to be the ID of the actual button. We then use the spread operator on our track state variable to create a new list of tracks. After which, we use the filter method to find the track containing the track ID matching that of our button ID. Lastly, we store the track information inside of our track detail state variable. Now we'll create one more component to hold the detail information. By the way, I forgot to update the listbox component to call the click event method it received from the app component, so be sure to do that or you will freak out. We've introduced somewhat quote-unquote new syntax here when we created our detail component. We're passing our track object to the track detail component, but we're using the spread operator with it. In turn, the properties or key value pairs of the track object are extracted for us. This allows us to use object destructuring in our component where we can access the actual property name directly. Pretty cool, right? I'd say this came together pretty nicely, even though it looks like crap right now. I'm going to go ahead and add the styling so this can look halfway decent. You can stick around and watch, although that kind of sounds inappropriate, or you can skip ahead. But whatever you do, please don't leave. It won't take me long. So I'll be right back. So we actually finished our app. The styles have been added. It looks pretty good. It's actually working, which is most important. And it was completely done in React. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope it was better than the last tutorial I did because I should be getting better. Please feel free to leave comments on the video. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if there's another tutorial you'd like me to do. Until next time, I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Please continue to like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell icon, all that jazz, and I will see you on next time.